October 23, 1943. Rechlin Experimental Airfield, Germany. Major Hans-Werner Lerche pushed the throttles forward on the captured Boeing B-17 Farads, feeling the 4 Wright Cyclone engines respond with their distinctive rumble. Beside him in the co-pilot's seat sat Flugkapitän Otto Behrens, a combat veteran who had attacked American bomber formations over France and barely survived the experience. Today, they would fly this captured fortress not as enemies, but as students trying to understand a weapon system that had fundamentally altered the mathematics of aerial warfare. Through the bombardier's position in the plexiglass nose, they could see the arrangement that had troubled Luftwaffe tactical planners for months. 2 Browning M2 machine guns mounted on flexible frames, each capable of bringing half-an-inch diameter projectiles to bear on attacking fighters. But the real revelation would come later, during the firing tests that would force German fighter commanders to rewrite their tactical doctrine completely. The defensive firepower concentrated in American heavy bombers had become the Luftwaffe's most pressing tactical problem by autumn 1943. German fighter pilots returned from missions over occupied Europe with reports that seemed impossible to intelligence officers who had never witnessed it themselves. Attacking a tight formation of B-17 seconds meant flying into a storm of tracer fire so dense that survival seemed a matter of pure chance rather than skill or tactics. The mathematics behind this firepower had been theorized in Luftwaffe planning documents, calculated on paper by aeronautical engineers who understood ballistics and fire concentration. But theory and experience were proving to be vastly different things. Today's test at Rechlin would demonstrate why American bomber formations had become nearly impossible to penetrate without catastrophic losses. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The concept of convergence zones in aerial gunnery was not new to German military thinking. Luftwaffe fighter pilots understood the principle perfectly. Their own cannon and machine guns were bore-sighted to converge at specific ranges, typically 200 to 400 meters, creating a concentration point where all weapons fired by a single aircraft would strike the same area simultaneously. At that precise range, a skilled pilot could deliver devastating firepower to a target, with multiple projectiles impacting within a small area. But the Americans had taken this concept and applied it not to a single aircraft, but to entire formations of bombers flying in precisely coordinated geometric patterns. The result was something German tactical planners had never encountered before in the history of aerial warfare. The B-17 Farads sitting on Rechlin's flight line had arrived in German hands through the forced landing of Lieutenant Paul Flickinger's aircraft near Melun, France, on December 12, in 1942. The bomber, nicknamed Wolfhound by its American crew, represented the first intact flying fortress to fall into Luftwaffe possession in flyable condition. For nearly a year, German engineers and test pilots had studied every aspect of this aircraft. They had measured its structural strength, analyzed its manufacturing techniques, evaluated its Wright Cyclone engines, and documented its advanced systems. But the most significant tests involved the defensive armament. Understanding how 9 Browning M2 machine guns positioned throughout the aircraft could create overlapping fields of fire that made attacking the bomber a potentially fatal proposition for any fighter pilot. Major Lerche had accumulated more experience flying captured Allied aircraft than perhaps any other Luftwaffe pilot. His methodical approach to test flying, combined with an engineering background and from university studies, made him ideally suited for the demanding work of evaluating enemy technology. He approached captured aircraft without ideological prejudice, seeking to understand their capabilities objectively so that German fighter pilots could exploit weaknesses and avoid strengths. What he had learned about the B-17's defensive armament over months of testing had fundamentally changed his respect for American tactical doctrine and industrial sophistication. The Browning M2 heavy machine gun firing the .50 caliber BMG cartridge represented one of the most successful weapons designs of the 20th century. Developed by John Browning in 1918 and refined throughout the 1920s and 30s, the weapon combined reliability, accuracy, and devastating terminal ballistics. Each round measured 5.5 inches in length, and weighed approximately 1.7 ounces. The projectile itself, a half-inch diameter bullet weighing between 650 and 700 grains depending on variant, left the barrel at approximately 2,900 feet per second. The kinetic energy delivered by this projectile at typical air combat ranges exceeded 12,000 foot-pounds, more than 3 times the energy of German 7.92 mm rounds, and roughly equivalent to German 13 mm heavy machine gun ammunition. But energy alone did not explain the .50 caliber's effectiveness against aircraft. The ammunition's terminal ballistics had been optimized specifically for aerial combat through years of development and testing. The standard ball round used armor-piercing cores, capable of penetrating typical aircraft aluminum skin at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. Tracer rounds, typically loaded in a ratio of 1 tracer to every 4 or 5 ball rounds, allowed gunners to observe their fire and adjust aim accordingly. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds combined penetration capability with incendiary effects that could ignite fuel or hydraulic fluid. This varied ammunition mix meant that every burst from a .50 caliber gun delivered multiple effects simultaneously. Some rounds would penetrate structure, others would mark the trajectory for aim correction, and still others would attempt to start fires in vulnerable systems. German intelligence had captured examples of American .50 caliber ammunition early in the war and subjected them to extensive testing at ballistics laboratories. The results troubled Luftwaffe ordnance specialists who understood the implications. At ranges where German rifle-caliber defensive guns became marginally effective, the .50 caliber remained lethal. At ranges where German 13 mm heavy machine guns reached their maximum effectiveness, the .50 caliber was just entering its optimal engagement envelope. The weapon's effective range against aircraft targets exceeded 800 yards, nearly double the effective range of German rifle-caliber weapons. This range advantage meant American gunners could begin engaging attacking fighters before German pilots reached their own optimal firing positions with 20 mm or 30 mm cannon. The B-17 Farads carried 9 of these weapons positioned to provide overlapping coverage across nearly every approach angle a fighter might use. The tail position, enclosed in a powered Cheyenne turret, mounted 2 guns with excellent visibility and wide traverse. The dorsal turret, a Sperry design, carried 2 more guns with 360-degree azimuth coverage. The ball turret underneath the fuselage held another pair, providing complete lower hemisphere coverage. 2 waist gunners stood at open windows along the fuselage midsection, each manning a flexible .50 caliber. The bombardier and navigator in the nose operated flexible guns through sockets in the plexiglass glazing, providing forward defensive coverage. Later, B-17G models entering service in summer and fall, 1943 would add a remotely operated chin turret with 2 more guns, bringing total armament to 13 weapons. But even with 9 guns, the B-17 Farads created defensive zones that German fighter pilots described as impenetrable walls of fire. The mathematics of this defensive arrangement became clear only when considering formations rather than individual aircraft. American tactical doctrine, developed through painful combat experience and refined continuously based on after-action reports, positioned bombers in tight 3-dimensional arrays called combat boxes. A basic element contained 3 aircraft flying in close formation. 3 elements stacked vertically with horizontal offset formed a squadron of 9 bombers. 3 squadrons composed a group of 27 aircraft, though some groups flew with fewer aircraft due to maintenance issues or combat attrition. The entire formation flew as a coordinated unit, with each bomber's guns supporting its neighbors. German test pilots at Rechlin had studied captured American formation diagrams and tactical manuals obtained through various intelligence channels. The documents revealed sophisticated thinking about mutual defensive fire. American tacticians had calculated optimal spacing between aircraft to maximize overlapping gun coverage while minimizing collision risk during evasive maneuvers. They had determined ideal altitude separations between elements to create vertical stacking that provided clear fields of fire without friendly aircraft blocking shots. They had developed radio procedures for coordinating defensive fire, allowing multiple gunners to concentrate on single targets when threats warranted massed response. But understanding the theory on paper differed vastly from experiencing the reality in combat. German fighter pilots who survived attacks on American formations described the experience in terms that seemed almost supernatural to officers who had never witnessed it. They spoke of approaching bombers and suddenly finding themselves in a cone of tracer fire so dense it appeared solid. They described the psychological impact of watching hundreds of tracers converge on their aircraft from multiple bombers simultaneously. They reported the disorienting effect of trying to aim while their fighter was being struck repeatedly by 50 caliber projectiles that could destroy engines, shatter canopies, sever control cables, and kill pilots. The test program at Rechlin aimed to quantify these subjective reports and determine exactly what made American defensive fire so effective. Engineers had installed instrumentation throughout the captured B-17 to measure various parameters during firing tests. They had set up ground observation posts with high-speed cameras to photograph firing patterns. They had recruited experienced Luftwaffe fighter pilots to fly simulated attacks in Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf Fock W 190 seconds, while the Fortress's guns fired tracer rounds. The goal was to understand the convergence zones where multiple guns could engage a single target simultaneously, creating concentration of fire that dramatically increased hit probability. Major Lerche and Flugkapitän Behrens took the B-17 through its pre-flight checks with methodical precision. Starting the 4 engines required careful sequencing to avoid hydraulic lock and ensure proper oil pressure. Each Wright Cyclone R-1820 produced 1,200 horsepower at rated altitude, and the bomber carried 4 of them in nacelles, suspended below and ahead of the wings. Total available power of 4,800 horsepower drove the 30-ton aircraft to speeds approaching 300 miles per hour and operational ceilings above 35,000 feet. The engines started smoothly, their distinctive radial configuration producing a deep rumble that differed markedly from the higher-pitched sound of German inline engines. Taxiing the massive bomber required careful attention to throttle management and brake application. The B-17's tricycle landing gear provided excellent ground handling compared to conventional tailwheel configurations, but the aircraft's size and weight demanded respect during ground operations. Lerche guided the Fortress to Rechlin's main runway, where ground crews had positioned orange marker panels to indicate safe areas. The test would involve multiple passes over the firing range, while gunners in the various positions engaged ground targets with live ammunition. High-speed cameras positioned at strategic points would record the firing patterns, while observers would note the density and distribution of fire. The takeoff was routine, the 4 engines providing ample power to lift the bomber into autumn skies over Mecklenburg. Lerche climbed to 10,000 feet and established a stable orbit near the firing range. Below, ground crews had erected target arrays designed to simulate fighter aircraft approaching from various angles. The targets were simple fabric panels mounted on frames, positioned at ranges corresponding to typical combat engagement distances. When struck by 50 caliber fire, the fabric would show clear hits that could be photographed and analyzed. In the tail turret sat Feldwebel Klaus Richter, an experienced Luftwaffe gunner who had flown combat missions in German bombers before being selected for this special test program. The Cheyenne turret provided excellent visibility through clear plexiglass panels, and the powered traverse responded smoothly to his control inputs. He could swing the guns through wide azimuth and elevation ranges, tracking targets with mechanical precision. The computing gun sight helped calculate lead angles needed to hit moving targets, though for today's test against stationary ground markers, the calculations were simpler. The first firing pass approached the range from astern, simulating a German fighter making the traditional tail attack that had been standard Luftwaffe doctrine early in the war. Richter centered his sight on the target panel and pressed the firing button. The twin 50 calibers roared to life, their combined rate of fire reaching 1,500 rounds per minute. Every 5th round was a tracer, creating visible streams of fire that arced toward the target. The guns hammered against their mounts, spent casings ejecting to be collected in bags that prevented them from jamming the turret mechanism. Through his sight, Richter watched the tracers converge on the target panel. The fabric erupted in a pattern of holes as the heavy projectiles tore through it. On the ground, observers noted the firing pattern with professional interest. The two guns, bore-sighted to converge at 400 yards, created a concentration zone approximately 3 feet in diameter at that range. Within this zone, the probability of a projectile being present at any given instant was extremely high. A fighter flying through this cone would almost certainly be struck multiple times, but this was just one turret from one bomber. In combat, attacking fighters would face fire from multiple turrets on multiple bombers simultaneously. The test continued with passes from different angles. The dorsal turret gunner engaged targets positioned to simulate beam attacks from the side. The ball turret operator tracked targets below, demonstrating the complete lower hemisphere coverage. The waist gunners fired at targets offset to represent quarter attacks from behind and slightly to the side. Each position demonstrated effective coverage of its assigned sector. Each gunner could bring concentrated fire to bear on targets within his field of view. The individual effectiveness was impressive, but the real revelation came when they simulated formation fire. For this portion of the test, ground crews had positioned target panels at various points in a three-dimensional space, representing the area around a bomber formation. The B-17 would fly a series of passes while multiple gunners engaged targets simultaneously, simulating the coordinated defensive fire that American formations employed in combat. High-speed cameras would record the tracer patterns, allowing analysts to determine the density of fire at different points in space. Major Lerche flew the bomber along the designated track, while the gunnery officer, Hauptmann-Werner Schmidt, coordinated fire from the various positions. Over the intercom, Schmidt called out targets and assigned them to specific gunners. The tail turret engaged targets aft. The dorsal turret swung to address threats from above and to the sides. The ball turret covered the lower hemisphere. The waist gunners handled quarter attacks. The nose guns, operated by German bombardier trainees, addressed frontal threats. The combined effect was stunning even to the German observers on the ground who had expected impressive results. The tracer patterns, photographed by multiple cameras and later analyzed frame by frame, showed something that theoretical calculations had predicted, but which seemed almost incredible when witnessed. At specific points in space, corresponding to typical fighter approach corridors, the density of fire exceeded anything seen in previous weapon systems. The convergence zones, where fire from multiple guns on multiple bombers would overlap in combat formations, created areas where the probability of a fighter being struck approached certainty. Oberst Friedrich Lang stood in Rechlin's analysis room 3 days after the firing tests, studying enlarged photographs that quantified what German fighter pilots had been experiencing over France and Germany. The images, captured by high-speed cameras during the B-17 firing demonstrations, showed tracer patterns with a clarity that made the defensive problem undeniable. At 400 yards, the distance where German pilots typically began their firing runs with 20mm cannon, a fighter approaching from the tail quadrant would encounter fire from at least 4 heavy machine guns simultaneously. The photographs showed the convergence zone as a cone of tracers approximately 10 feet in diameter, densely packed with projectiles traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. Lang had commanded fighter units since 1940 and held the Knight's Cross for his actions during the Battle of Britain. He understood aerial combat, as well as any officer in the Luftwaffe. What troubled him about these photographs was not just the density of fire from a single bomber, but the implications when multiplied across formations of 20 or 30 aircraft. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. If one B-17 could create a kill zone 10 feet wide, what would 9 bombers in a squadron box create? What about 27 aircraft in a group formation? The answer was visible in the photographs taken during simulated formation fire tests. Ground crews at Rechlin had positioned the captured B-17 to represent different aircraft in a typical American combat box formation. They flew repeated passes while varying the gunner assignments to simulate fire from adjacent bombers in the formation. The resulting photographs showed overlapping cones of fire that created zones where multiple bombers could engage a single target simultaneously. A fighter making a tail attack on a bomber in the center of a formation would face fire not only from his intended target, but from 2 or 3 other bombers whose tail gunners could bring their weapons to bear on the approaching threat. The computing section at Rechlin calculated the probabilities with Prussian thoroughness. At combat ranges between 400 and 600 yards, a fighter in a tail attack approach corridor would be exposed to fire from an average of 4.2 bombers in a standard 9-aircraft squadron box. Each bomber fired 2 tail guns at approximately 750 rounds per minute per gun. Combined, this meant approximately 6,300 rounds per minute, converging on the approach corridor. Translated to rounds per second for tactical understanding, that was 105 heavy machine gun bullets, filling a space roughly 30 feet wide and 10 feet tall every second. German pilots attacking from the tail had approximately 4 seconds from entering effective defensive range at 600 yards to breaking away at 200 yards to avoid collision. During those 4 seconds, over 450 caliber projectiles would pass through the approach corridor. The fighter presented a target approximately 30 feet wide by 8 feet tall from the tail aspect. Statistical analysis suggested that a fighter making a straight-in tail attack would be struck by an average of 8 to 12 projectiles during the approach, assuming the gunners achieved only modest accuracy of 2% hits. 8 to 12 hits from 50 caliber projectiles was more than sufficient to destroy most German fighters or kill their pilots. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, with its relatively light construction optimized for performance, could be knocked down by 3 or 4 solid hits to critical areas like the engine, cockpit, or tail surfaces. The more rugged Focke-Wulf Fellow 190 might survive 6 or 7 hits if they struck non-critical areas, but 8 to 12 hits would almost certainly prove fatal. These statistics explained why German fighter units attacking American formations were suffering loss rates approaching 20% per mission during heavy combat periods in late 1943. Oberst Lang studied a different set of photographs showing frontal attacks, the tactic that had emerged as the preferred approach for German fighter pilots by mid-1943. Attacking from 12 o'clock high, diving from above and ahead of the bomber formation, had initially seemed to offer better survival prospects. Early B-17 models, including the F variant that comprised most of the bomber force through mid-1943, mounted only 2 or 3 flexible guns in the nose operated by the bombardier and navigator. These crew members had other primary duties and were not dedicated gunners. The flexible guns had limited traverse and required physical repositioning between shots. Most importantly, the combined closing speed of fighter and bomber during a head-on pass exceeded 500 miles per hour, giving the nose gunner perhaps 2 seconds to aim and fire before the fighter flashed past overhead or underneath. The photographs from Rechlin's tests showed why this tactic had worked for skilled German pilots through spring and summer 1943. The nose guns could engage targets only within a relatively narrow cone directly ahead of the bomber. A fighter diving from above at a steep angle or approaching from slightly below the nose could stay outside this engagement envelope for most of its attack run, entering the defended zone only in the final second before firing. This gave the attacking pilot a significant advantage. He could line up his shot carefully while the bomber presented an almost stationary target in his gun sight, growing larger but maintaining the same basic position. Meanwhile, the bomber's nose gunner had to track a rapidly approaching target while compensating for wind blast, vibration, and the psychological pressure of watching a fighter dive directly at him with guns blazing. But the photographs also showed what was about to change. Pinned to the wall beside the images of B-17 Farad's nose armament were intelligence photographs of the new B-17G model entering service with American bomber groups in autumn 1943. The most significant modification was immediately apparent. A powered chin turret had been installed directly under the nose, mounting 2 50 caliber machine guns in a remotely operated housing that could track targets through wide traverse angles. This turret, controlled by the bombardier through a computing gun sight, transformed the B-17's frontal defensive capability. Oberst Lang had reviewed interrogation reports from Luftwaffe pilots who had already encountered the new G model in combat. Their descriptions were uniformly grim. The chin turret could engage attacking fighters from first detection at long range, tracking them throughout their approach and maintaining fire until the fighter passed overhead or broke away. Combined with the existing cheek guns and the dorsal turret, which could rotate forward to add its 2 guns to the defensive barrage, a B-17G could bring 6 to 8 heavy machine guns to bear on a frontal attacker. The tactic that had offered German fighter pilots their best survival chance was rapidly becoming as deadly as tail attacks had always been. The implications were discussed at length during a conference Oberst Lang convened at Rechlin on October 28, 1943. Attending were squadron and group commanders from fighter units that had been heavily engaged against American bomber formations, plus technical specialists who had studied the captured B-17's defensive systems. Also present was General Major Adolf Galland, recently appointed as General of the Fighter Arm and responsible for all Luftwaffe fighter operations. Galland's presence indicated the seriousness with which High Command viewed the defensive firepower problem. Major Egon Meyer of Jagdgeschwader II opened the tactical discussion with a presentation based on his combat experience. Meyer, credited with 25 bomber kills by this point in the war, had pioneered the head-on attack doctrine that German fighter pilots had adopted widely. His analysis was blunt and professional. The frontal attack had worked because early B-17 models lacked effective nose armament. The new G model with its chin turret was rapidly eliminating this advantage. Within months, as more G models reached operational units, frontal attacks would become as costly as tail attacks. The Luftwaffe needed new tactics urgently. Hauptmann Wilhelm Moritz of Jagdgeschwader 53, operating from bases in southern Germany, presented data from his unit's recent encounters with American formations. His group had lost 6 fighters destroyed and 4 damaged in a single engagement on October 15, while attacking B-24 Liberators escorted by P-38 Lightnings. The damaged fighters had expended all their ammunition attacking bombers without achieving any confirmed kills. The undamaged fighters had been forced to break off attacks prematurely when American escort fighters intervened. The mission had been a complete failure, demonstrating that even when German fighters reached the bombers, they could no longer guarantee mission success. The discussion turned to ammunition expenditure, a problem that had emerged as critically important. Hauptmann Joseph Zwernemann, an ordnance specialist, presented calculations that troubled everyone in the room. The average Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, the most common German fighter variant in late 1943, carried 200 rounds per gun for its 220mm MG 151 cannon mounted in the wings. Firing time at standard rate of fire was approximately 12 seconds total before running Winchester. During a typical mission against American bombers, a pilot might have opportunity for 2, perhaps 3 attack runs before being forced to disengage due to fuel constraints or intervention by American escort fighters. Combat analysis from recent missions showed that achieving a bomber kill required an average of 20 to 25 hits from 20mm cannon shells. This figure assumed the hits were distributed across vulnerable systems rather than concentrated in a single non-critical area. The B-17's rugged construction, redundant systems, and self-sealing fuel tanks allowed it to absorb tremendous punishment and continue flying. A bomber struck and in one wing might lose some lift and require the pilot to trim for the damage, but would remain flyable. A bomber with one engine destroyed would feather that propeller and continue on 3 engines. Even bombers with 2 engines out on the same side sometimes made it back to England, demonstrating resilience that German bombers could never match. If a pilot needed 25 hits to guarantee a kill, and his accuracy under combat conditions averaged 2% based on gun camera analysis, he needed to fire approximately 1,250 rounds to achieve 25 hits. But his aircraft carried only 400 rounds total across both cannon. This meant that even if he expended all his ammunition against bombers, achieving perfect attack positioning and textbook gunnery, he could expect to damage perhaps one bomber seriously enough to force it from the formation. Achieving an actual kill required either exceptional skill, extraordinary luck, or both. The mathematics grew worse when considering formation defensive fire. A fighter making an attack run against a bomber formation would be under fire from multiple aircraft for approximately 4 to 6 seconds during the approach and breakaway. During this time, the pilot experienced severe psychological stress that degraded his marksmanship significantly below training range's performance. He was trying to aim while his aircraft was being struck by 50 caliber projectiles that made sounds ranging from sharp cracks when they passed close by to thunderous bangs when they struck structure. The natural human response was to flinch, to tense muscles involuntarily, to break off the attack prematurely before reaching optimal firing range. General Major Galland listened to these presentations with the expression of a man watching his worst fears confirmed by objective data. He had flown combat missions in Spain, Poland, France, and during the Battle of Britain. He understood aerial combat as both a tactician and pilot. The defensive firepower demonstrated at Rechlin and quantified by his officers represented a fundamental problem that could not be solved through better tactics or improved pilot training alone. The Americans had created a weapons system that was, by design, nearly impossible to attack without suffering unacceptable losses. The discussion turned to potential solutions, each examined and found wanting. Some officers suggested attacking from extreme range using rockets or bombs dropped from above the formation. These standoff weapons offered the advantage of engaging bombers beyond effective range of defensive machine guns. The Werfer Granate 21 rocket, a 21-centimeter unguided projectile with a large high-explosive warhead, had shown promise in tests. Launched from tubes mounted under fighter wings, these rockets could theoretically break up bomber formations through blast effect, even without direct hits. But operational experience with the Werfer Granate had been disappointing. The rocket's accuracy was extremely poor beyond 800 yards due to its poor ballistic characteristics. The weapon was heavy, reducing fighter performance significantly. The underwing tubes created drag that made the launching fighter vulnerable to American escort fighters. Most critically, the rockets rarely achieved direct hits on bombers in the tightly packed formations, and near misses, while frightening to bomber crews, rarely caused serious damage to the rugged B-17 seconds. The tactic of standoff attacks with rockets had failed to produce results justifying the performance penalties and vulnerability it imposed on German fighters. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Another proposal involved developing heavier cannon that could destroy bombers with fewer hits. The 30mm Mk108 cannon, already entering service on some fighter variants, delivered devastating explosive power. A single 30mm hit on a critical system could cripple or destroy a bomber. Tests at Rechlin had shown that 3 to 5 solid hits from 30mm cannon would bring down any bomber, regardless of where the shells struck. This seemed to solve the ammunition expenditure problem elegantly. But the Mk108 had significant limitations that prevented it from being a complete solution. The weapon's muzzle velocity was relatively low at approximately 1,700 feet per second, barely more than half the velocity of the MG151 20mm cannon. This low velocity meant the projectile followed a curved trajectory that required significant lead angle calculation, especially against crossing targets. The Mk108 was essentially a close-range weapon, most effective inside 400 yards, where the trajectory was relatively flat. Beyond that range, hitting a maneuvering target required exceptional skill and experience. More problematically, getting within 400 yards of a B-17 formation meant entering the most lethal zone of defensive fire. At that range, American gunners achieved their highest hit percentages. Tracers converged so densely that pilots described flying through solid walls of fire. A fighter pilot trying to close to within 400 yards for an Mk108 shot would be exposed to concentrated defensive fire for several seconds, during which he would almost certainly be hit multiple times. The Mk108 might require fewer hits to kill a bomber, but achieving those hits demanded accepting risks that many pilots found psychologically impossible to overcome. The conference attendees also discussed formation tactics designed to overwhelm defensive fire through coordinated attacks from multiple directions simultaneously. The theory was sound. If multiple fighters attacked a bomber formation from different angles at the same moment, the defensive gunners would be forced to divide their fire among multiple threats. No single fighter would face the full concentration of defensive firepower that made attacks so costly. Some fighters would be engaged heavily, while others enjoyed relatively unmolested attack runs. The tactic required precise timing and radio discipline that German fighter units struggled to maintain under combat conditions. Hauptmann Heinrich Sturm of Jagdgeschwader 11 described his unit's attempts to implement coordinated attacks during October missions. The results had been mixed at best. Coordinating multiple fighters to attack simultaneously required radio communication that alerted American escort fighters to German intentions. The American escorts, now including longer-range P-47 Thunderbolts equipped with external drop tanks, would intervene before German fighters could execute their coordinated attack, forcing them into defensive maneuvering that scattered formations and eliminated the timing precision required for the tactic to work. Even when coordination succeeded and multiple fighters attacked simultaneously, the American formations maintained disciplined defensive fire that engaged each threat sequentially, negating much of the advantage German pilots hoped to achieve. The truth emerged gradually through these discussions, though no officer wanted to state it explicitly. There was no tactical solution to the defensive firepower problem. American combat boxes created zones of overlapping fire so dense that penetrating them meant accepting casualties that German fighter forces could not sustain indefinitely. The mathematics were brutal and clear. American industry could replace bomber losses faster than German fighters could inflict them. American training programs could replace lost bomber crews faster than experienced German fighter pilots could be developed. And most critically, American bombers could absorb damage that would destroy German aircraft, meaning that even successful attacks often failed to produce kills. General Major Galland understood these realities with painful clarity. His closing remarks to the conference were remarkably frank for a senior officer speaking to subordinates. The Luftwaffe faced a defensive problem that could not be solved through tactics alone. American strategic bombing doctrine, combining heavily armed bombers flying in mutually supporting formations with increasingly capable long-range escort fighters, had created a system that was approaching invulnerability. German fighter forces could inflict losses on American formations, sometimes heavy losses when conditions favored the defense. But they could not stop the bombing campaign. The industrial and material disparity between Germany and the United States meant that America could sustain current loss rates indefinitely, while Germany could not. The only path forward, Galland suggested, was a combination of approaches, none of them entirely satisfactory. Fighter production needed to increase dramatically to provide numerical parity with American and British forces. New jet aircraft like the Messerschmitt Me-262, still in development, might offer performance advantages sufficient to overcome defensive firepower through sheer speed. But these solutions required time that Germany might not have, and resources that were increasingly scarce as the strategic situation deteriorated. The officers departed Rechlin with clear understanding of the problem, but no clear solution. The tests with the captured B-17 had quantified what pilots were experiencing in combat. The convergence zones, where multiple 50-caliber machine guns could engage a single target simultaneously, created kill zones that were extremely difficult to penetrate without casualties. American bombers, flying in disciplined formations with mutually supporting defensive fire, had effectively made daylight strategic bombing feasible despite determined fighter opposition. This represented a revolution in aerial warfare doctrine that would influence military aviation for generations to come. Major Hans-Werner Lerche continued flying the captured B-17 through late 1943 and into 1944, conducting additional tests as new intelligence requirements emerged. Each flight reinforced his professional respect for American engineering and tactical thinking. The defensive armament system was not simply a collection of guns mounted on an airframe. It was a carefully integrated weapons system designed around the specific mission of penetrating enemy airspace despite fighter opposition. Every aspect of the B-17's design supported this mission. The guns provided firepower, the armor protected crews, the rugged structure absorbed damage, the redundant systems maintained functionality. The combination created a bomber that could fight its way to the target and back home again. German fighter pilots developed various tactics to counter the defensive firepower throughout 1944, achieving occasional successes that demonstrated skill and courage. Some pilots specialized in close-range attacks from directly astern, closing to within 100 yards before firing concentrated bursts and breaking away violently. At such close range, even brief firing opportunities could produce devastating hits on critical systems. But this tactic demanded nerves of steel and precise timing. Pilots who misjudged their breakaway timing sometimes collided with the bombers they were attacking, killing everyone aboard both aircraft instantly. Other pilots developed beam attacks from the side, approaching at right angles to the bomber's flight path. This minimized exposure time to defensive fire, as the fighter flashed past the bomber in seconds rather than boring in along a predictable approach corridor. But beam attacks required exceptional deflection shooting skills to hit a target crossing at high speed. Most pilots lacked the experience and natural ability to master this difficult gunnery problem. Gun camera footage from beam attacks showed fighters firing entire ammunition loads with only 1 or 2 rounds actually striking the target. A few exceptionally skilled pilots learned to attack from below, approaching in the B-17's blind spot between the ball turret's maximum depression angle and the waist gunner's field of view. This small zone, perhaps 15 degrees of elevation, existed because the ball turret could not depress fully downward while the aircraft was in level flight. The landing gear bay prevented the turret from rotating to cover areas directly below the aircraft. Attacking through this narrow window required the pilot to approach from significantly below the formation, climb precisely into the blind spot, fire a quick burst, then break away before the bomber could maneuver to bring guns to bear. Few pilots possessed the spatial awareness and precision flying skills to execute this attack repeatedly. These specialized tactics achieved occasional successes and were taught to new pilots at training schools throughout Germany. But they could not change the fundamental arithmetic of the air war. For every successful attack that destroyed a bomber, dozens of attacks failed to achieve kills. For every bomber shot down, American factories built 5 more. For every bomber crew killed or captured, American training schools graduated 10 more crews. The defensive firepower that so impressed German officers at Rechlin was just one component of a comprehensive strategic bombing system that included industrial production, crew training, tactical doctrine, and operational logistics. Germany could not match any of these components, and the cumulative effect was devastating. By early 1944, the convergence zones that had so troubled Luftwaffe planners at Rechlin in October had become even more lethal as B-17G models, equipped with chin turrets, replaced earlier variants in frontline service. American formations now bristled with 13, 50 caliber machine guns per bomber instead of 9. A squadron of 9 B-17Gs carried 117 heavy machine guns. A group of 27 aircraft fielded 351 machine guns. Combat boxes containing 70 or 80 bombers concentrated over 1,000 heavy machine guns in a formation that occupied perhaps 2 cubic miles of airspace. The defensive fire density had increased by nearly 50% within months, making attacks even more costly for German fighters. Luftwaffe loss statistics reflected this increasing lethality. During Big Week in February 1944, when Allied forces launched intensive raids against German aircraft production facilities, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 500 fighters destroyed, with many pilots killed or wounded. American losses were significant as well, with hundreds of bombers damaged or destroyed, but the Americans replaced their losses within weeks while German fighter forces never fully recovered. Experienced pilots died in numbers that training programs could not replace, forcing units to accept pilots with minimal combat experience who died on their first or second missions before learning effective tactics. The convergence zones created by massed 50-caliber machine guns had fundamentally altered the equation of aerial combat in a way that favored defenders over attackers. In previous conflicts, fighter pilots had enjoyed advantages of speed, maneuverability, and initiative that allowed them to dictate engagement terms. They could attack when conditions favored them and disengage when they did not. Against American bomber formations, these advantages eroded significantly. The bombers' defensive firepower forced fighters to attack through kill zones, where survival depended as much on luck as skill. The psychological impact was severe and well documented in German military medical records from the period. Fighter pilots began showing symptoms of combat exhaustion at much higher rates than earlier in the war. Some experienced pilots requested transfers to other theaters or to ground duties, rather than continue flying against American bombers. Others developed psychosomatic illnesses that removed them from combat status. The most troubling cases involved experienced pilots who froze during attack runs, unable to force themselves to fly into the walls of tracer fire, despite understanding intellectually that evasion guaranteed mission failure. The Luftwaffe's medical officers recognized these symptoms as rational responses to impossible tactical situations rather than cowardice. But the military system had no good solutions. The pilots were needed for combat operations regardless of their psychological state. The story of the captured B-17 at Rechlin and the convergence zone tests conducted there represents a small footnote in the larger narrative of the strategic bombing campaign. But it illustrates how American tactical doctrine, engineering sophistication, and industrial capacity combined to create weapons systems that could not be countered through skill or tactics alone. The 50-caliber machine gun was not individually superior to German cannon in terms of destructive power per hit, but 8 or 13 such guns positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, multiplied across dozens of bombers flying in coordinated formations, created defensive zones that were nearly impenetrable without accepting catastrophic casualties. German officers who witnessed the firing tests at Rechlin understood this reality immediately, even though finding solutions proved impossible within the constraints of Germany's strategic situation. The convergence zones, where multiple guns could engage single targets, simultaneously transformed bomber defense from individual weapons into a coordinated system. American doctrine emphasized this system approach, training gunners to call out targets and coordinate fire rather than engaging threats independently. German fighter pilots faced not just individual guns but an integrated defensive network that tracked their approaches, concentrated fire at critical moments, and maintained engagement throughout attack and breakaway phases. The psychological impact on German fighter pilots cannot be overstated. Flying into concentrated defensive fire required extraordinary courage even for experienced combat veterans. Watching tracers converge on your aircraft, hearing rounds strike structure, feeling the aircraft shudder from impacts, all while trying to aim accurately and press attacks home, demanded mental fortitude that most humans simply do not possess naturally. German pilots did their duty courageously, pressing attacks despite horrific casualties. But human endurance has limits, and by mid-1944, those limits were being reached throughout German fighter forces. The captured B-17 at Rechlin continued serving German interests through mid-1944, flying evaluation missions as new questions emerged about American bomber capabilities. But its most significant contribution had been the firing tests in October 1943 that quantified defensive firepower and demonstrated convergence zones. Those tests provided objective data confirming what pilots had been reporting. The photographic evidence and statistical analysis removed any doubt about the severity of the defensive firepower problem. German tactical planners could no longer dismiss pilot reports as exaggeration or attribute difficulties to poor tactics or inadequate training. The problem was real, quantifiable, and fundamentally insoluble given Germany's material constraints. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.